Have you ever woken up in the middle of the night with a start and all of a sudden your face covers over with a cold sweat and you realize that you've forgotten to turn off the oven on the beautiful stew that you had been making for the last 12 hours and it's so much lost opportunity? Well, I've at this AGU had the same sort of feeling because I woke up realizing that I've spent 30 years of my life working with a shallow ice shelf approximation in my modeling, and I've only been using 2/3 of the framework of that approximation. I've been focusing on the horizontal flow of the ice shelf, but the framework also tells us about the vertical flexure, the vertical kinematic of the ice body. And this is a great omission. It would be, for those of you who are ice sheet modelers, think of it this way. If you had spent 30 years trying to model the advance and retreat of the Laurentide ice sheet through the Pleistocene, how would you feel if you woke up and realized that you had completely neglected glacial isostatic adjustment as part of your modeling? That would be a really lost opportunity. Well, anyway, the framework of shallow ice approximation allows us to reduce the dimensionality of an ice shelf from 3 to 2, and for the vertical aspect of that of the ice shelf motion, what we do is we parameterize all stresses and strains in terms of a two-dimensional function, Greek letter eta, which is the displacement of the ice shelf in the vertical direction from a position of rest. And this is a very important and interesting aspect of the ice shelf because it's only the flexure of the ice shelf that can get stresses to maximize at the top and bottom surface. For those of you who are students of shallow ice approximations for ice shelves, it is the velocity that is independent of depth, not the stress. And the stress is maximum in the shallow ice shelf approximation within the interior of the ice shelf at the strongest membrane. Well, wouldn't it be true, but anything that is discovered has usually been discovered before, and it turns out that the great genius Niels Ray was the person who about 50 years ago illuminated the way to understand how to use the thin ice approximation to do vertical motions of ice shelves either with an elastic or a viscous approximation. Now today I'm very interested in combining the elastic and viscous rheologies of ice because that is absolutely necessary for many of the loading problems that ice shelves face. For example, if you put a surface lake on an ice shelf and you only have an elastic approximation, when you remove the surface lake by draining, then you simply restore the ice shelf to its original stress-free equilibrium. But if you have viscoelasticity, you get the opportunity to get 2 points of severe elastic stress, both when you load the ice and then after the ice is relaxed, when you then unload the ice, you go backwards through the cycle. Note the crevasses here. The crevasse that Tavi Murray pointed out in her magnificent talk yesterday that produces icebergs on the Helheim Glacier is the one that's closest to the grounding line. And you'll ask, well, why is this picture still valid? Well, remember, that's Greenland in 1968, not Greenland in 2014. So how do you deal with viscoelasticity? Well, the key thing is that viscoelasticity is not a physical law. It is an amalgamation procedure, an approximation procedure to combine two physical laws, elasticity and viscous flow. And basically there's three ways to do it. Either you say the total vertical displacement is the sum of an elastic and a viscous component, or you say that the total bending moment being the vertical integral of the stresses that are appropriate to driving flexure, you say that that the bending moment is the sum of an elastic and viscous part. But that's not right for ice shelves. And of course you can have combinations of the two. Well, my colleagues and I have put together a viscoelastic flexure model using the thin ice approximation. And I'm going to show you now 3 applications. They're somewhat primitive, but they're designed to show you all the things that we've missed over the past 30 years by not paying attention to this. The first is the rebound of superglacial lakes when they drain. This is the equivalent on an ice shelf of glacial isostatic adjustment. And what I show here are 2 phases of a superglacial lake, one where it's loaded with surface water, and you can see one set of cracks developing due to the elastic stresses that are, of course, slowly dissipating after the lake has been there for a while. And then after a sudden drainage event, the lake hydrostatically pops up out of the ocean, and you get a second regime of elastic cracks, which then again also dissipate over time. The picture that you see there is an example of a pop-up lake that's drained, also called a doe line, on the George VI ice shelf. Oops, got to go the right way. Here is the conceptual, or an approximation of the conceptual idea of the model. As is common, you draw a spring dashpot together in some sequence, in this case in the Maxwell sequence, to describe viscoelasticity. But I've added one other element, and that is called the buoyancy bucket. And the idea is if a surface lake is represented by a load that you put into the buoyancy bucket, as shown by the little dumbbell with the M on it, then over time as you put water in the lake, the first thing that happens is that the string takes up all of the stress, and the spring thus represents an opportunity for fracture. But then as time goes by, the dashpot slowly responds to the load until the load is hydrostatically adjusted and all stresses are absent. And in that case, the spring is returned to its normal stress-free state. But now when you drain the lake suddenly, there's an excess of buoyancy in the bucket, and that is taken up immediately by the spring with maximum stress again, an opportunity for fracture. But then over time, the viscous response of the dashpot restores the spring to zero stress state. So here is an example of what happens to the depth of a lake, shown in the bottom graph, in an experiment where you load the lake for 60 days. It's a 2-meter deep lake, 500-meter radius. And then after 60 days, you suddenly drain the lake as if a hydrofracture developed to remove the surface load. And what's significant here is that even while the lake is filling, it never quite manages to achieve hydrostatic equilibrium. And even more significant, over the entire year following the drainage of the lake, the surface of the ice shelf never gets back to its starting point. It's actually still depressed, sort of like an isostatic, depression that is still underway towards rebounding. And there's a wonderful implication here, and that is that if you had a sequence of years, let's say 10 years, where you fill and drain lakes, every year that you refill the lake, you're starting from a deeper basin. So it implies that even without lake bottom ablation, you can make lakes deeper over a period of time. And this may be informing us a little bit about why the Larsen ice shelf over time continued to become more sensitive to the lakes that were developing on its surface. Moving on to a second application. This one was motivated by an abstract I saw in preparing to come to this meeting. The abstract is listed on the bottom. It's a poster. And here the investigators are interested in understanding what is the surface expression and basal expression and internal layer structure associated with a meltwater channel, which starts as a furrow that's sort of carved into the bottom of the ice shelf as it crosses the grounding line, let's say at the Beardmore Glacier. So you imagine a bedrock high point, and as the ice hits the floating ocean, begins to float on the ocean, there's a furrow in the bottom of the ice shelf. But the ice surface, when it enters the ice shelf, doesn't know that it is about to have to deal with hydrostatic equilibrium and Archimedes' principle. So I wanted to ask, how long would it take for the surface to show a depression that would be indicative of this subglacial furrow? And the result on the left here shows what happens if you do nothing other than just put the furrow in the ocean and let it run out for 100 years. Basically, you get a little tiny depression at the surface, but you wouldn't see it because the elastic strength of the ice shelf, 800 meters thick, is so large that the very narrow 1 kilometer furrow just is unable to produce a buoyancy forcing that deforms the ice shelf in a sort of tightly compact regional way. The ice shelf is simply too stiff. But I had the benefit of looking at the radar profile that's published in this abstract, and I realized, well, they do have internal layers that are downwarped, and they have these things called saddlebags that are sticking down on either side of the furrow. So what I did is, following the abstract, is I added 100 meters of additional melting to deepen the submarine channel, assuming it's a channel that is inhabited by a meltwater plume that continues to melt. So you see the additional melting there on the right. And then I also decided that whatever downfall there was at the surface of the ice shelf, I would allow that depression to accumulate more snow. And that's the key thing. If you accumulate more snow at the same time as you remove ice from the bottom, you're sort of giving the ice shelf a double whammy, and you are able to force the flexure that gives you a 50-meter saddle bag on either side of the furrow on each side. So this might be of interest to those who study the Pine Island Glacier and ice shelf, looking at the surface topography of the ice shelf as it comes off the grounding line and then is developed both by responding to what is coming over the grounding line and to new melting that is carving away at the submarine interface of the ice shelf. Well, finally, we get to iceberg calving, and I realize I'm close to the end of my 15 minutes. This again was discussed by Niels Ray, and to make a long story short, we can simulate the ice front flexure by specifying the bending moment. And when we do that, we find that we're able to predict sort of a crumbling state of the front of the ice shelf, where the flexure stresses are maximized within a narrow region. And that is broadly similar to what we see, let's say, here in the Larsen ice shelf, where right along the ice front it appears to be crumbling, probably because the downwarping flexure due to bending moment at the ice front. So in conclusion, the low-order shallow shelf approximation with all three of its components serves as a springboard for full-Stokes models of ice shelves. I love full-Stokes models, and their best property is that they are able to reproduce shallow shelf behavior. And finally, we should be able to observe viscoelasticity on ice shelves. This is both good and bad. It's good because there are a lot of problems we can solve with it that I've indicated there, but also it should give a little tingle of fear on those of you who are doing altimetry of ice shelves to understand possible basal melting. Here's another source of noise for you, because ice shelves do not necessarily have to be locally in hydrostatic equilibrium. And if they're not in local hydrostatic equilibrium, they will be changing over time because of viscoelasticity. And with that, I will stop.
We got time for a question while we switch over.
That remains to be seen. The elasticity is very important for our problem with lakes. But in the case where we have 100 years there, we're probably indeed looking just at a viscous response. But it's easy to have both together.